In the summer of 1939, Don Fendler was just 12 years old, a Boy Scout from Rye, New York, living the kind of childhood that embodied the American ideal of the time. His world revolved around baseball games, swims in the local lake, and the thrilling tales found in pulp magazines stacked beside his bed. Life was simple, suburban, and safe. But that summer, during a family trip to Maine, a world far harsher than anything he had ever imagined was about to reach out and test him. Maine's rugged wilderness hides many secrets, but none more daunting than Mount Katahdin. Towering 5,267 feet above sea level, its name comes from the Penobscot people, meaning the greatest mountain. And it lived up to that name in every sense. With its knife-edge ridges, abrupt weather shifts, and vast surrounding wilderness, Katahdin had claimed experienced adult lives long before the Fendlers arrived. What happened next would push a young boy beyond the brink of human endurance and etch his name into the pages of American survival history. July 17th began as a day filled with promise. The Fendler family, Don, his father, his brothers Tom and Ryan, and their friend Henry Condon, set out on what was supposed to be a routine hike up the Hunt Trail. The air was warm. Don wore a t-shirt, wool sweater, dungarees and sneakers, nothing more. That was typical for the time. Hiking in the 1930s was far removed from today's standards. There were no GPS devices, no waterproof outer layers or emergency radios. Back then, even children tackled mountains with minimal supplies and maximum optimism. As the group climbed, the family began to drift apart, also not unusual then. Don and Henry, being the youngest and fastest, surged ahead, eventually reaching the exposed plateau known as the Tableland. It was here, amid the breathtaking views, that the mountain began to shift. Fog crept in. Temperatures fell. Visibility dropped. It happened fast, too fast. Henry, sensing the danger, urged caution. But Don, filled with youthful confidence, insisted he'd go ahead and meet the others at the base. He never found the trail. Within minutes, thick fog swallowed the landscape. Familiar features vanished. Trail markers disappeared. And just like that, Don Fendler was alone on the mountain, heading not towards safety but deeper into a sprawling, merciless wilderness. His first cries, "Dad! Henry!" echoed into nothingness. Panic surged. In his rush to reconnect with the trail, Don began to move faster, not realizing he was heading in the wrong direction. Then came the fall. Wet rock, a slip, and a brutal tumble down a rocky slope left him bruised and disoriented. When he stood up again, nothing around him looked familiar. Dusk began to fall. Rain followed. Don had no food, no shelter, no way to make fire. And unknowingly, he had wandered to the eastern side of the mountain, opposite from where his family expected him to descend. Every step he took now carried him farther from the search teams who would soon begin scouring the mountain. As night swallowed the woods, Don found what little shelter he could beneath a fallen tree. Soaked, freezing, and utterly alone, the boy who had never known true fear began to pray. "Please," he whispered into the darkness, "help me find my way out." That first night would be one of the least challenging of the ordeal to come. At dawn, the world was still wet, cold, and utterly silent. Don's clothes clung to his skin. Mosquitoes and black flies descended on him in droves. He was covered in bites within minutes. Still, he remembered one piece of Boy Scout training: follow water downhill. Streams, they said, eventually lead to people. So he followed one. But this was not a stream that would lead to safety. This one would carry him deeper into the forest's uncharted belly. He waded through frigid water, clambered over rocks, slept in brush. He foraged when he could, eating wild blueberries, fiddleheads, even strips of birch bark. His sneakers began to fall apart. Hunger gnawed constantly. Sleep was brief, plagued by insect bites and the eerie sounds of the wilderness. Yet somehow he kept walking. Back on the mountain, panic had gripped the Fendlers. Don's father hoped he had simply taken another trail. But by nightfall, with no sign of him at any trailhead, the awful truth set in: Don was missing. Rangers organized search teams, combing the area by foot and shouting his name. But Don had already moved miles beyond the area they believed he might be. Days passed. The boy was now a walking skeleton of what he had once been. His feet were blistered and raw. His shirt hung in tatters. Black flies had left his skin peppered with over 400 bites. Each day was colder and each night darker than the one before. Till he moved. The story of the missing boy caught fire in the press. Newspapers ran front-page headlines. Radio broadcasts delivered updates by the hour. The governor of Maine called in the National Guard. Hundreds of volunteers joined the effort. President Roosevelt himself would eventually read about the lost boy on Mount Katahdin. And through it all, Don kept walking. On the fourth day he slipped again. This time while crossing the stream. The current swept him away, bashing him into rocks and dragging him underwater. When he finally crawled to shore, his pants were gone, his sneakers torn from his feet. Now barefoot and nearly naked, he continued on, cut, bleeding but still moving. He couldn't afford to stop. Every 10 steps he would rest. Then another 10. And another. By the 5th and 6th days, the boy's situation had reached a critical point. His body, deprived of nourishment, had begun to cannibalize its own muscle tissue just to stay alive. Every step became an act of pure determination, each footfall marked by blood stains left on jagged stones by his bare, torn feet. Insects had feasted on his exposed skin, and the bites, now infected, swelled with pain. The weather turned cruel once more, cold rain drenching his thin clothing and driving his body temperature dangerously low. With no matches and no means of building shelter, he had no choice but to curl beneath fallen logs or under the sparse protection of evergreen branches, trembling through long, merciless nights, his teeth chattering so violently he feared they might crack from the force. Then came the visions. Hunger, exhaustion, isolation, these elements combined to unravel even the strongest minds. The hallucinations crept in, not merely images but voices, familiar ones. He spoke of seeing houses, imagining smoke curling from their chimneys, only to reach empty clearings. He heard his mother calling to him through the forest, her voice so vivid that he would call back, only to find he was speaking into silence. On one particularly harrowing night, a phantom version of his younger brother appeared, walking just ahead through the darkness. He followed the illusion for nearly an hour before collapsing when the mirage dissolved into nothing. These weren't random delusions, but part of a known psychological response called woodland voices, a desperate mind interpreting wind and rustling leaves as the comforting voices of loved ones. It's a phenomenon well documented among survival psychologists, especially in children, where the brain rewires perception to simulate companionship. Ironically, it's an evolutionary mechanism meant to reunite lost tribe members, but in true survival scenarios it can prove lethal. By the 7th day, the rescue operation had exploded in scale. Over 1,000 people searched the mountain and its surrounding wilderness. Bloodhounds, helicopters, aircraft flying grid patterns, all deployed to find a 12-year-old boy who had now been missing for a full week. Yet with each hour, hope thinned. The rule of threes is well known in survival circles. 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter in harsh conditions, 3 days without water and 3 weeks without food. He had now endured 7 days exposed to the elements, with barely any water and almost no food. Medical experts consulted by the authorities shared a grim consensus. A child under these conditions wouldn't likely last more than 5 to 7 days. Behind the scenes, the tone of the operation had shifted from rescue to recovery. But what no expert could quantify was the sheer force of will residing in that boy's fragile frame. Though severely weakened, hallucinating, and battered, he kept following the stream. His weight had dropped from about 90 pounds into the mid-70s. His body was in metabolic freefall. By the 8th day, walking was nearly impossible. His simple survival tactic, follow the water, had become a battle waged moment by moment. Talking to himself became a lifeline, the raspy whisper of his own voice echoing through the woods. Just keep going. Just one more step. During this darkest phase, faith became the thread that held his mind together. Short, repeated prayers gave form to days that had lost all meaning. The hope of seeing family again became his singular motivation, a beacon in a place where everything else had faded. That night, as searchers camped with heavy hearts, few still held hope. They had found no tracks, no signs. Even seasoned rescuers had begun to accept the worst. But out beyond their reach, something unexpected had occurred. By sheer determination and blind luck, the boy had traveled nearly 35 miles from where he'd first gotten lost. It had placed him well beyond the original search perimeter, and ironically, closer to salvation than ever before. Day 9 broke on July 25, 1939. By any logical prediction, the boy should not have lived to see that sunrise. His body had endured over a week of starvation, infection, and exposure. But he opened his eyes. That morning, the landscape shifted. The stream he had followed widened and merged with the Wasatakoik stream. The terrain grew slightly easier. Though nearly at the brink of collapse, he noticed subtle hints of human presence. A boot print, a snapped branch, something. But after so many false visions, he didn't trust his senses. Not yet. Then, through the trees, something real, something solid came into view. A cabin. A small hunting camp near the stream's junction. Using the very last of his strength, he staggered toward it. When he appeared in the doorway, the caretaker gasped. What stood there looked less like a child and more like a ghost from the forest, emaciated, covered in dirt and dried blood, with sunken eyes and tangled hair. "My God," the man whispered. "You're the Fendler boy." The boy barely managed to whisper, "Yes." But survival was not the end of his ordeal, it was only the beginning of recovery. His condition was critical. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, infections, exposure, all had pushed his body to the edge. In modern medicine, victims of such extreme deprivation must be reintroduced to food slowly to avoid refeeding syndrome, a dangerous metabolic shock. But in 1939, these protocols didn't exist. The caretaker's wife, a nurse, began carefully hydrating him and treating his wounds. It was an improvised recovery, no less miraculous than the survival itself. Word of the rescue spread within hours. Across the nation, newspapers that had prepared to report tragedy instead printed headlines of triumph. Radio broadcasts interrupted programming to announce it. The lost boy had been found alive. His mother collapsed with relief. His father, who had refused to leave the mountain, wept openly. Don was transported to a hospital where he was treated for over 400 insect bites, infected lacerations down to the bone, signs of early organ failure, and a weight loss of 16 pounds. America, still clawing through the shadows of the Great Depression and staring down the uncertainty of a coming war, needed a story like Don's. A reminder that hope, resilience, and determination still held power. Incredibly, recovery came swiftly. Within weeks he regained weight and strength. The psychological scars ran deeper, but he emerged from the ordeal with a sense of clarity that would shape the rest of his life. President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself recognized the boy's bravery, awarding him the Army and Navy Legion of Valor's Medal for outstanding youth heroism in 1939. But fame was never the goal. "I just did what I had to do," he told reporters again and again. What followed was a life of service. He joined the Navy in World War II, later served in the Army during Korea, crediting his time lost in the wilderness for building the endurance that saw him through. Psychologists would later study survivors like him, identifying a phenomenon called post-traumatic growth, the ability not just to endure trauma, but to transform because of it. Don became a textbook example. In 1978, nearly 4 decades later, he co-authored Lost on a Mountain in Maine, a first-hand retelling of those 9 days written for young readers. The book became part of Maine's school curriculum, a guide to survival, a lesson in courage, and a legacy that saved lives. Don spent years visiting schools, telling his story, teaching children how not to get lost, and what to do if they ever were. "If my story helps even one child," he often said, "then everything I went through has meaning." Don Fendler passed away on October 9, 2016, at the age of 90. He lived a full life, one carved not just from hardship, but from purpose. And his legacy? It echoes in every hiker who packs an extra map, every camper who remembers to stay with the stream, every parent who teaches a child what to do if they lose the trail. A boy got lost in the woods, but what he found would guide generations. His story stands among the most extraordinary child survival accounts in American history. Not solely because of the sheer physical challenge it entailed, but because it offered a powerful testament to the boundless resilience of the human spirit when confronted by nature at its most merciless. Mount Katahdin, regal, foreboding, and indifferent, remains just as majestic and perilous as it was during the summer of 1939. Yet today, hikers approach it with deeper caution and greater preparation, guided by the legacy left behind by a 12-year-old boy who refused to give in to despair. That boy was Don Fendler. His journey began with a single misstep, a moment of separation during a hike, and quickly spiraled into a 9-day battle for survival in the unforgiving wilderness of Maine. With no supplies, no shelter, and no clear direction, he found himself utterly alone, armed only with remnants of Boy Scout training, a prayerful spirit, and a determination far beyond his years. As the days wore on, Don's body turned against him. Dehydrated, starving, and injured, he was forced to consume his own muscle tissue just to keep moving. His bare, lacerated feet left smears of blood on every rock. Insects had feasted upon him, and their bites swelled and festered across his skin. The weather shifted cruelly, cold rain drenched his already tattered clothes, plummeting his body temperature to dangerous lows. There were no matches, no tools. At night, he huddled beneath branches and against fallen logs, trembling so violently from cold and fear that he worried his teeth might break. And then came the hallucinations. Hunger, exhaustion, and isolation began to unravel his grip on reality. His senses betrayed him, houses with warm chimneys vanished as he approached, and familiar voices echoed through the woods only to dissolve into wind. One night, he became convinced that his younger brother was walking just ahead of him. He followed that spectral figure for nearly an hour before collapsing, the illusion disappearing into the darkness. Psychologists call them woodland voices, auditory hallucinations often heard by those stranded in the wild. The mind, starved for human contact, begins to twist the sounds of rustling leaves and gurgling streams into familiar, comforting tones. It's a survival mechanism, designed by evolution to keep scattered tribe members connected. But in cases like Don's, it threatens to lure victims deeper into danger, burning away precious energy as they chase phantoms. By the seventh day, the search effort had become massive. Over 1,000 people, dozens of aircraft, bloodhounds from neighboring states, the operation blanketed the region and dominated headlines across the country. Yet behind closed doors, hope was rapidly waning. Medical experts whispered grim predictions. A child exposed this long with no food, no shelter, and minimal water? Survival beyond 7 days was improbable. Quietly, the mission shifted from rescue to recovery. What the experts didn't know, what they could never predict, was the fire still burning inside Don Fendler. Weakened, delirious, and alone, the boy kept moving. Day 8 arrived and he could barely walk. Every step was agony, every breath a battle. But he found strength in rhythm, repeating words of encouragement to himself, whispering through cracked lips, just one more step. And when even that began to fade, faith became his refuge. He recited simple prayers, not for deliverance but for the strength to continue. The dream of seeing his family again became the thread that stitched each moment together. As the search crews lost hope, Don stumbled onward, unaware that he had traveled nearly 35 miles from where he was last seen. He had unknowingly wandered beyond the primary search zone, but closer to salvation than at any point since his disappearance. Dawn broke on the 9th day, July 25, 1939. By any medical standard, he should not have opened his eyes. His body, ravaged by exposure and starvation, was at its limit. But something in the forest had changed. The stream he'd followed for days now joined a wider current, the Wassataquoik. The terrain eased slightly, and through blurred, sunken eyes he noticed something. A flicker. A shape. The unmistakable silhouette of human presence. It was a small hunting camp, and it would become the miracle that saved him. With the last dregs of strength, Don staggered toward it. His appearance was ghostly, his skin painted in blood and mud, hair matted, eyes hollow. The caretaker who opened the door nearly collapsed from shock. "My God, you're the Fendler boy." And with a whisper he confirmed it, yes. Though his survival was secured, the battle was far from over. His condition was dire, dehydrated, malnourished, covered in infected wounds, and exhibiting early signs of organ failure. In 1939, the protocols for treating extreme starvation were not yet understood. Today it's known that refeeding a starving person too quickly can trigger a deadly metabolic crash. Yet somehow, with slow, careful care from the camp owner's wife, a trained nurse, Don's body began to stabilize. News spread like wildfire. Radios interrupted broadcasts. Newspapers reversed headlines that had prepared the nation for tragedy. The Fendler boy was alive. When word reached Don's family, the scene was heartbreakingly human. His mother collapsed in relief. His father, who had refused to abandon the search, wept openly. Don was soon airlifted to a hospital where the true extent of his ordeal was catalogued. Over 400 insect bites. Feet shredded to the bone. A weight loss of 16 pounds and a soul that had stared into the abyss and chosen to press forward. The country needed hope in 1939. The Great Depression had dragged on. War was looming. And here was a story that reminded America of its inner strength. A child who survived one of the nation's wildest places, armed with nothing but courage, determination, and faith. President Franklin D. Roosevelt awarded Don the Army and Navy Legion of Valor's Medal for Outstanding Youth Hero. But for Don, the fame meant little. "I just did what I had to do," he often said. "I didn't give up." That spirit shaped the rest of his life. He served in the Navy during World War II and again in the Army during Korea. Survival psychologists speak of a phenomenon called post-traumatic growth, the ability of individuals to not only endure trauma but to become stronger from it. Don Fendler became the living embodiment of that principle. His military record showed it. His quiet humility proved it. In 1978, nearly 40 years later, he co-authored Lost on a Mountain in Maine, a first-hand account written for young readers. It became required reading in schools throughout Maine. But more than that, Don devoted his life to educating others, especially children, on wilderness safety. He turned trauma into teaching, ensuring that others would be better prepared because of what he had endured. "If my story helps even one child," he would say, "then everything I went through has meaning." Don Fendler passed away on October 9, 2016 at the age of 90. His life was long, his legacy enduring, his story immortal. Today, Mount Katahdin still towers over the Maine wilderness, as majestic and dangerous as ever. But because of Don's journey, countless hikers approach it, and every wilderness with more caution, more respect, and more readiness. That awareness, that shift, is his true legacy. The story of a young boy lost in the wild, and the unyielding spirit that brought him home. If Don Fendler's incredible survival story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Liking the video helps us reach more people who enjoy true stories of resilience and courage. What do you think was the key to Don's survival? His physical endurance, mental strength, or the skills he learned as a Boy Scout? Share your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next video, and remember, ordinary people can do extraordinary things when pushed to their limits.